Hello and welcome to Hegel on the beach. We're not exactly in the beach today. We're in Llandudno in Wales, and we're in St Tidno's graveyard, which is very close to the sea, and also it's like been a site of religious practice for maybe, you know, nearly 2,000 years. And as we're talking about religious practice, we're talking about the relationship between philosophy and religion as well. I thought it'd be a nice place, and also it's a nice day as well. So I thought I'd hit part two. If my papers rustle, then you'll have to forgive me if it picks up on the mic. Okay, so from last week, picking up where we did last week, I said that I was gonna start the introduction and skip the preface of Phenomenology of Mind by Hegel, but I've had second thoughts because I need to do a bit more background. But I do want to look at one small part of the preface to Phenomenology of Mind. The preface is, unfortunately, 72 dense and very difficult paragraphs. And Hegel himself explains that we've got to read the whole book before to understand the preface, really, because of course the preface was written after the book was written and after he completed the book. But I'll start with paragraph 12. So he says this: a building is not finished when its foundation is laid, and just as little is the attainment of a general notion of the whole itself. So Hegel is telling us that the preface can only give us the most general conception of the whole conception of the book, and therefore gives us only the most general idea of where the book's going to end up going. And in the preface, we're being told that there's an intellectual journey and it's going to be really tough. And as the philosopher Tom Rockmore put it in a book, I don't know whether he agrees with this, but it's a great quote. He only half jokingly said that Hegel is very difficult to understand, and if he did find the truth, he kept it to himself. Hopefully, there'll be some truth we can find on the way. Paragraph 11 explains the historical significance of this book in Hegel's own words, very modestly, jokingly. So, okay, picture this. Okay, Hegel has just finished writing Phenomenology of Mind. He completed the book maybe even just before the French army under Napoleon entered Hegel's adopted hometown of Jena. And Hegel himself was a spectator on the streets of Jena while Napoleon himself he rode past. And this was the day before the Battle of Jena in 1806. And there's a great cartoon from, I think it's a magazine called Harper's in 1895, which shows Hegel carrying the manuscript of Phenomenology of Mind under his arm, while, of course, Napoleon rides past and he's looking at Napoleon on his horse through the streets of Jena. So paragraph 11 says this: it is not difficult to see that in our epoch is a bare time and a period of transition. The spirit of man has broken with the old order of things, and is in the mind to let them all sink into the depths of the past. Now, that is a straightforwardly pro-Napoleon statement, don't you think? And it's in the text, but also he wrote a letter to say that it was a great he wanted Napoleon to win the battle. Or rather, it is straightforward, but I like to think of it as Hegel recognizing that revolutionary figures have a positive and a negative side. So Lenin in history, he's either presented as a savior or a saint. It's the same with Napoleon. And also, don't you think it sounds a bit like the Communist Manifesto? So here's the Communist Manifesto. I think the first sentence of the second. A spectre is haunting Europe. The spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exercise this spectre. So you can see there's a bit of a link between the two. I don't think it's a conscious link. Marx copied them, but I think it's there. The preface therefore tells us it's going to set out a path to a new epoch over the ruins of the ideas and the philosophies of the past. On the way, the book will take us through Christianity, amongst other things, Judaism, ancient Greece, the French Revolution, the Terror, and loads of other historical stuff. And different forms of human understanding are going to emerge, and they're going to be frustrated, and they're going to be inadequate to explain new phenomena and the way society is moving. A new type of, I hate to use the word self, but self-understanding is, according to Hegel, in the preface, about to be realized in post-revolutionary Europe. And if you look at where Hegel was, he's looking forward to the transformation of German society. I mean, German society is, I may have mentioned it in the last one, but it's like a society of like small states and, like princedoms and dukedoms, and nothing is uniform. So it's divided into loads of territories, and Hegel is also looking forward to a huge revolutionary change in German society. And the last video explains how for Hegel, I think the key point was that love is more important than law. And Hegel's model of a good society would be essentially pre-industrial and small town. So it would be something like the town of Bedford Falls, in the Frank Capra film, It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart, yeah? The Isn't it wonderful? I'm going to jail. That's Stewart's thing, isn't it? Small town stuff. And in the Capra film, in our ideal community, we all know each other, and our lives directly touch one another. They directly touch our neighbours, our friends, and it's in very straightforward ways they touch. There's no sort of mediation, there's no indirectness. And that's described by the angel Clarence, God who's saying, he describes how Jimmy Stewart's life touches on everybody else's. And if he wasn't there, it would be a disaster, because making moral choices really matters. Individual moral choices matters. And love is more powerful than law. And Hegel, unlike Capra, he changed this model of love as the basis of human interaction. And this seems to have taken place after he wrote The Spirit of Christianity, which I touched on in the last lecture. Or maybe, to put it another way, his model of love evolved. And what's changed his mind? So George Lukács, who was the Hungarian Marxist, not in favour now, I don't think, in Hungary, but he said, it's highly probable that the study of Adam Smith was a turning point in Hegel's evolution. And, as soon as anyone from the left hears the word Adam Smith, your eyes roll naturally, because today Adam Smith's name is probably best known as a free market apostle of Thatcherism, and his work's notorious through the right-wing institute of the Adam Smith Institute. And their mission is this: it's to promote neoliberal and free market ideas. Unashamedly, they say that. And they believe in low taxes, a voucher-based education system, and private healthcare. And the Institute's president, whose name's Madsen Piri, he described the ASI like this on his website. He says, we propose things which people regard as being on the edge of lunacy. The next thing you know, they're on the edge of policy. So the ASI boasts of its own insanity. But Adam Smith himself, he was no, and it's their words, he was no lunatic. And God only knows what he would have thought of the ASI and Madsen Piri. And for our purposes today, we need to distinguish between the historical Smith and the Thatcherite Smith, and to look at how and why his non-lunatic ideas influenced Hegel. So although Lukács rightly mentions Smith as a mentor, or as an influence at least on Hegel, his first meaningful encounter, Hegel's first meaningful encounter with political economy, was a study of the Scottish Enlightenment thinker, Sir James Stewart. And I'm not making it up. His name was Jimmy Stewart too, this Enlightenment thinker. The same as in Frank Capra's model, only he had a different model of sociality than James Stewart. And we read his work, An Inquiry into the Principles of Political Economy. So this Jimmy Stewart character, not the actor in It's a Wonderful Life, he's important because through him, Hegel appears to begin to see the problem of alienation, and he starts to see how we're connected to each other in ways that are more economic than religious and moral. I mean, it's all wrapped up together, but he's reading economics now, and religion doesn't go away, but Hegel becomes fascinated with economics through Stewart. Apart from, of course, starring in films, James Stewart was a theorist of mercantilism. That means like profit arises through when the seller exchanges are higher than he bought it for, basically. He believes in a positive trade balance and keeping all the gold and silver in the country. So mercantilism, it's a bit like, the way Putin behaves now, and Xi Jinping, which is accruing loads of money, and then you've got a strong nation and so on. So these ideas actually haven't gone away, have they? Mercantilism, we think, oh, it's an 18th century philosophy, but it was still there. But anyway, we're not going to talk too much about mercantilism. It's a bit of an aside. But so Hegel wrote an introduction or a summary of his book. I think it's lost in 1799, after he completed The Spirit of Christianity. And he continued to look at the implications of these Scottish economists, and had a big influence on his developing system. So Hegel was also reading a guy called Adam Ferguson. Thank God he hasn't got a namesake in acting. But he was another product of the Scottish Enlightenment, and he was friends with Adam Smith and David Hume. And we might come to David Hume's philosophy later on in a later video, but I want to briefly mention he was the originator of Hume was of the bundle theory of experience. That experience, human experience, our experience, is a bundle of sensations. Okay, so we might, and we probably will have to come back to that. But moving on, Ferguson, not Hume, Adam Ferguson, important in our story because he was maybe the first modern theorist of spontaneous order. And that is, rational and effective outcomes can and do result from uncoordinated actions of many individuals not connected to each other directly. So Ferguson says this. He says, I'll do my Scottish accent now. Every step and every movement of the multitude, sorry for the accent, even in what are termed enlightened ages, are made with equal blindness to the future, and nations stumble upon establishments which are indeed the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. So you can see it's just a short step there to Adam Smith's invisible hand. And the invisible hand, which of course, Hegel read Smith, of course. The invisible hand was Smith's metaphor of how unintended social benefits were brought about by self-interested, self-seeking individuals. And it's a description of the free market, basically, that we've got today. So me going to shops boosts the economy. Me, I don't know, doing other stuff as its unintended consequence. So according to Smith and his theory of moral sentiments, the invisible hand was the work of a divine being, or divine perfection, or divine providence, or divine benevolence. So, there's some argument whether or not Smith believed in a personal God, or whether he was a deist, God's everywhere, or he was an atheist, or whether he believed in God on logical or moral grounds. But definitely in the theory of moral sentiments, there's a mention of like the divine hand acting behind the back of human consciousness and human intentions. So on the surface, there is a religious element again, but in the churchyard, there's a religious element to a lot of this Enlightenment thinking, Hegel and Smith and so on. So one final point about this progressive aspect of Smith before we move on. So I've got a quote. So Smith said this: civil government, so far as it is instituted for the security of property, is in reality instituted for the defence of the rich against the poor, or those who have some property against those who have none at all. Now, you won't see that on the Adam Smith Institute website, of course, and I know because I've checked. As important as the idea of the invisible hand was for Hegel, actually, in directing this new model of the way humans interact, Smith's description of a pin factory, the pin factory, that as it's an example of the division of labour, that seems to have been even more significant for Hegel. Specialization and the division of labour increases productivity, and Hegel uses the pin factory example in two different places in his Jena lectures of 1803 and 1804, before he wrote Phenomenology. So in the pin factory, Smith describes how each worker is engaged in a specialized task, like a modern production line. So production up to that point involved workers pretty much making the whole product from scratch. One person or a child would just make a pin out of metal and he'd get the metal himself, and there was no specialization. It's not like the Charlie Chaplin, modern times thing where everyone's got a specialized task. So Smith notices this phenomenon and brings it to people's attention, to public attention. Much later in the philosophy of right, this is the 1820s, Hegel explains this. He says, by this division of labour, the work of the individual becomes less complex, and consequently his skill at his section of the job increases like his output. Yeah, straightforward. At the same time, this abstraction on one man's skills and means of production from another's completes and makes necessary everywhere the dependence of men on one another and their reciprocal relation to the satisfaction of others' needs. Further, the abstraction of one man's production from another makes work more and more mechanical, and finally, man is able to step aside and install machines in his place. And there's a lot in there, isn't there? So Hegel's analysis of the increasingly abstract nature of work in a manufacturing environment shows insights which most probably derived either directly or through the writings of other Scottish writers from Smith's Pin Factory. And Hegel argued that since work is performed only to satisfy the need as abstract being for itself, the working becomes abstract as well. Each individual, because he is an individual, labours for a need, yet the content of his labour goes beyond his need. He labours for the needs of many, and so does everyone. Each satisfied the needs of many, and the satisfaction of one's particular needs is the labour of many others. Since his labour is abstract in this way, he behaves as an abstract I, according to the mode of thinghood, not as an all-encompassing spirit, rich in content, ruling a broad range and being master of it. So factory work's a nightmare. It's incredibly boring. It's very productive, but it destroys your soul. So Smith himself also was well aware of this dehumanizing consequence of modern factory work. The division and specialization of labor in the factory, it took, we know, a terrible toll and still does on workers. And the mind-numbing repetition of a few, this is Smith's word, of a few, I didn't say mind-numbing, that's mine, but he says, as few simple operations, frequently one or two, it renders the worker as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. And that's Smith's words. And so great was this evil that Smith believed that government ought to take some pains to relieve it. So for Smith then, the specialisation and division of labour is a two-sided process. It increases the production of things while, of course, dehumanising the producer and dehumanising the worker. So here, Hegel, he cites Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which is his most famous work in 1803-4, and he points out not only the abstract nature of factory labour, but it's dehumanisation, so he's just following on from Smith. And now Marx will independently arrive at a deeper notion of what abstract labour is later on. But you can see it's following in that tradition. And Marx, I'm not sure whether he was aware of the Jena lecture. Some people say he wasn't, I could be wrong. But he criticised Hegel's conception of as inadequate, his conception of labour. But he does say Hegel's standpoint is that of modern political economy. He grasps labour as the essence of man. As man's essence in the act of proving itself, he sees only the positive, this is the negative, not the negative sides of labour. Now, this observation from Marx that Hegel doesn't see the negative side of labour, that is wrong, because Hegel straightforwardly says it. He sees the negative and the positive sides of labour, and he seems to have understood this through Smith. So like Smith, Hegel explained self-interest as a type of, moving on, transcendent reason. Okay, so the fact that I've got to direct my conduct by reference to others introduces a form of kind of religious, almost quasi-religious universality. So it's from others that I acquire the means of satisfaction, and I must accordingly accept their views. At the same time, I'm compelled to produce means for the satisfaction of others. We play into each other's hands and so hang together. To this extent, everything private becomes social. So this is from the much later work, The Philosophy of Right. That's paragraph 191. I think the translation is not great. I've just copied a quick one from the internet. But it seems that Hegel already had this idea of transcendent reason. And by transcendent reason, I mean it's the social nature of reason. It's not that reason is the property of one brilliant individual mind. It's social. So moving on, Hegel therefore seems to have abandoned his very simple Jimmy Stewart, Frank Capra model of love as the way we should be connected to the world, with the much more morally compromised concept of sociality through economic necessity. Um, and he also replaced the Capra model we find in phenomenology with another thing, with recognition. So reason is social, recognition rather than love starts to take over Hegel's thinking. And finally, in the book, we also have the overarching role of history. Okay, and history is never the past for Hegel. History is with us. It's like geological sediment of the mind, and we are completely historical beings. So anyway, did in the last lecture we talked about the Jewish God, the God of Abraham and Noah. So was Hegel moving the God of Abraham, some of those external things back into his theory? I mean, I don't know, but I'll put it out there. I'm not sure, but the model of fatherly love in the shape of Jesus, that's no longer a solution to the operation of a modern industrial society and an enlightened society. And neither is the categorical imperative. You know, Kant's idea of like, here's the rules, do the right thing, do your duty. And neither is the model of ancient Greece, you know, the beautiful Greece with Plato and Aristotle strolling around and people building these gorgeous statues and having great thoughts and writing poems and great dramas. That's not either. Hegel recognizes that's the past. And sort of established churches, like Lutheran churches, they're not, I think there might be a service going on over there actually as we speak, but that isn't one either, you know, like even like sort of, you know, the Lutheran church. So the rest of the book will set out how Hegel thinks we arrived at modernity and where we're going to. Okay, so last couple of thoughts. Gonna turn over something. Yeah. So individualism and the separation of the private life from public activity, I think, which is kind of what Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment was talking about. They are kind of the foundations of modern society. So when people like Xi Jinping or Putin, they you know, Hegel would have bitterly opposed those type of dictators and the you know, the merging of the private with the public. We know we are individuals, you know, we're also social, but we are individuals. So I think enough of Hegel and enough of Scotland. Next time we're definitely going to be looking at the introduction, and I think we're going to be in the introduction. Hegel says we're going to go to the heaven of truth and not grasp at the clouds of error. Okay, so goodbye from Llandudno, goodbye from St Tidno's churchyard, and see you in the next one. Bye.